You just cuffed a federal agent. The words dropped like a detonator, calm, clear, irreversible. For a full second, no one breathed. The officer's smirk cracked. The crowd went still. Somewhere a phone kept recording, the red light blinking like a silent witness. Miles Carter stood tall, wrists bound, eyes steady. "What did you just say?" Officer Reeds barked, voice cracking under the weight of his own authority. Miles didn't blink. "I said, you cuffed the wrong man." The park froze in disbelief. "Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe." These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now back to how it started. It began 10 minutes earlier in Washington Park late afternoon, warm wind, ordinary peace. Miles was just ending a call, his tone precise, every word coded, routine for an FBI agent wrapping a counterintelligence debrief. No one would have guessed. No one ever did. He adjusted his tie, glanced at the fountain, and that's when the squad car rolled up. Blue lights slashed across the green lawn. Officer Reed stepped out like the ground belonged to him, palm resting on his holster, gaze sweeping Miles from shoes to skin. "What's your business here?" he asked, not curious, just ready. Miles stayed polite. "Talking on the phone, officer." "You look out of place," Reed said. "In a suit, standing around watching people." "I'm waiting," Miles replied. "For what?" "Someone who knows what they're doing." The tone was too calm. Reed's didn't like calm. He wanted control. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, the words slicing through the park. A mother turned, a jogger slowed. Miles raised his hands, slow, deliberate. He'd been trained for active shooters, explosives, riots, but nothing trained him for this quiet humiliation, this theater of bias in broad daylight. "You fit a description," Reed snapped. "What description?" Miles asked softly. "Tall, black, wearing a suit that doesn't belong." The cuffs clicked. The sound was sharp enough to draw stares. The phone in Miles's pocket buzzed once a coded alert from HQ, silent confirmation that his location was being monitored. He didn't flinch. "You think dressing up makes you safe?" Reeds muttered. "You people always try to look official." Miles looked him dead in the eye. "Funny. I was thinking the same thing." A ripple of gasps spread through the bystanders. One young man started filming. Reeds stiffened. "You watch your tone? You watch your assumptions," Miles answered. Every word was measured, every breath tactical. He was buying time. Because 2 blocks away, a black SUV with government plates was already on the move. Within minutes, this arrest would turn into an investigation, and Officer Reeds would learn, too late, that the man he'd humiliated was the one who trained the Bureau on civil rights protocols. But for now, all anyone saw was a calm black man in cuffs and a white officer losing his grip on power. The air thickened with tension. Miles didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The truth was already loud enough. The air in Washington Park was no longer quiet. It was charged, trembling between disbelief and outrage. Officer Reed's hand still rested on his holster, his posture rigid with the kind of fear that hides behind arrogance. Miles Carter stood motionless, the silver cuffs gleaming against his skin. His voice stayed low, almost calm. "You are making a mistake, officer," he said. "You do not belong here." Reed snapped back louder than before, trying to drown out his own uncertainty. A murmur rippled through the crowd. A teenager whispered, "He said he is federal." A woman in a business suit muttered, "Then why is he still in cuffs?" Miles did not respond. His training taught him that silence, when deliberate, could be louder than shouting. He looked around. The phones were up, dozens of tiny red lights recording everything. "You think you are intimidating me with your silence?" Reed said. "You think you are smarter because you have a fancy accent and that suit?" Miles lifted his eyes slowly. "Smarter has nothing to do with it. Protocol does." The words seemed to strike something in Reed's, but pride made him double down. "Protocol is what I say it is," he barked. Miles's mind flashed back to his first year in the Bureau, his mentor, Agent Lawson, telling him, "Out in the field, composure is your weapon. Lose that and you lose everything." So he did not move, not even when Reeds shoved his shoulder and repeated, "Answer me now." The crowd gasped, phones shaking in their hands. From across the park, a voice shouted, "Hey, he did nothing wrong." It came from a young officer, Reed's own trainee, Officer Miller, standing by the cruiser, pale and trembling. "Sir, I ran the check," Miller stammered. "His ID number came back valid. He is with the Bureau." Reeds froze. What did you just say? Miller swallowed hard. He is FBI, sir. The park went silent again, the kind of silence that presses down like guilt. Reed's jaw flexed, his authority evaporating in real time. That cannot be, he muttered. He was just standing here. Miles interrupted quietly. Existing is not probable cause. Miller stepped closer. Sir, we should remove the cuffs. Reeds ignored him, but his hand trembled. He looked at Miles, seeing him for the first time not as a threat, but as a mirror. Miles took a slow breath, his tone firm now. You profiled me, officer. You made a decision based on bias, not behavior. And now every person here has it on video. Reeds opened his mouth, but before he could speak, the sound of engines filled the air. 2 black SUVs rolled up along the path, windows tinted, unmarked plates gleaming in the Sunday. Agents stepped out in tailored suits, earpieces visible, moving with silent precision. The crowd parted instinctively. One of them, a woman with a calm face and a badge clipped to her belt, spoke first. Agent Carter, are you all right? The name alone shifted the atmosphere. The words Agent Carter carried authority, proof, and consequence. Reed's face went pale. Wait, he said weakly. You know him? The agent turned, her tone clipped. He is our lead on the federal task force, and you are going to want to take those cuffs off now. Reeds fumbled with the keys, but Miles stopped him. No, Miles said. Leave them. Let your captain take them off. I want the chain of command to understand exactly what this looked like. The crowd began clapping, quiet at first, then louder, a rhythm of justice rising in the open air. Miller stood still, eyes wide with disbelief. Reeds lowered his head. Miles looked at him one last time and said evenly, I told you, officer, the mistake was not the arrest. It was the assumption. And as the federal team surrounded him, the cameras kept rolling. The truth was already public, and the silence of Washington Park had never been louder. The scene in Washington Park had shifted from tension to reckoning. Officer Reed stood frozen, the weight of his own actions settling in his chest like a stone. The crowd, now fully aware of what had unfolded, watched in heavy silence as the lead federal agent stepped forward. Remove the cuffs, she ordered calmly. Now. Reeds fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as metal scraped against metal. The click of the cuffs releasing sounded louder than any siren. Miles Carter flexed his wrists once, his movements precise, his eyes fixed on Reeds. You still think you had the right man? He asked quietly. Reeds could not answer. The senior agent, a woman named Director Hayes, turned toward the onlookers. Everyone, please step back. We will handle this. But no one moved. They had seen too much to simply walk away. Phones were still raised, recording every second. A woman near the front spoke softly but firmly. No, we are staying. The world needs to see what happens next. Miles looked at her, then nodded slightly, a silent acknowledgement that she was right. Hayes spoke again, her tone sharp now. Officer Reeds, you detained a federal agent without cause, ignored proper verification, and escalated force against an unarmed citizen. Do you have anything to say for yourself? Reed's mouth opened, but nothing came out. It looked suspicious, he managed weakly. He looked suspicious. The repetition of those words landed like a confession. Miles stepped closer, his voice even but cutting. Suspicious, he repeated. That is the word people like me hear before we lose our freedom or our lives. I was making a phone call, that was my crime, the crowd murmured, anger simmering in the air. One man shouted, you could have killed him. Hayes raised her hand to calm them, but did not deny the truth. Officer Reeds, she said, you are hereby suspended pending federal review. Turn in your weapon and badge. Reeds stared at her, stunned. You cannot do that, he said. Hayes replied coldly, I just did. Another agent stepped forward and collected the items without ceremony. Reeds looked at Miles, eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. You set me up, he said bitterly. No, Miles replied. You set yourself up. I gave you every chance to do the right thing. You chose pride. Hayes gestured for the agents to escort Reeds away, but Miles raised his hand. Wait, he said. He needs to hear this. The crowd quieted again. Every time someone abuses their badge, it makes it harder for those who wear it with honor. I have spent 15 years defending this country, protecting people who will never know my name. And today, in front of witnesses, you made me the enemy because of my skin, not my service. That is not just racism, officer, that is betrayal. The words hung in the air like judgment. Even Reeds could not meet his eyes. Hayes spoke softly. Agent Carter, would you like to file the report personally? No, Miles said. I already have. He tapped his watch once, and Hayes' phone vibrated almost immediately. Incident log uploaded, she confirmed. Body cam footage cross-referenced. Everything is official. Miles nodded. Good. Then we proceed by the book. The applause that followed was not wild but steady, deliberate, a rhythm of agreement, of overdue justice. As Reeds was led toward the cruiser that had brought him, he glanced back at the man he had humiliated and saw not anger, but authority. Miles turned to the crowd. Do not just film injustice, he said. Challenge it. Then he looked back toward Hayes. I want a public statement within the hour. Let the department see that accountability is not optional. Hayes nodded. Already drafting it, sir. The crowd began to disperse slowly, but the energy lingered, heavy, electric, unforgettable. Miles took one last look at the open sky and whispered to himself, justice does not need noise, it just needs proof. And today he had both. As the flashing lights faded from Washington Park, the reality of what had happened began to settle over everyone present. The crowd lingered, unwilling to move on, as if leaving would somehow erase what they had just witnessed. Miles Carter stood quietly beside Director Hayes, his wrists still red from the cuffs, his composure unbroken. Let us take you back to headquarters, Hayes said gently. You should be checked out, Agent Carter. Miles shook his head. No, not yet. I am not done here. His voice carried the kind of calm that demanded attention. Reporters had already arrived, drawn by social media posts spreading faster than any official statement. A young journalist from a local station stepped forward. Agent Carter, can you confirm what just happened? Were you really detained for no reason? The cameras pointed directly at him now, but he did not flinch. You want confirmation? Miles said. You just saw it. The reason was not hidden. It was printed on my skin. The murmurs grew louder, people nodding, understanding what he meant without him saying the word. Hayes placed a hand on his shoulder. Miles, we will handle the press. He looked at her and replied quietly, no, silence is how this keeps happening. He stepped forward, his eyes meeting the camera lens as if speaking directly to the country. What happened here today is not new. It is not an isolated mistake. It is the echo of every time someone saw color before character and power before truth. I could have flashed my badge the moment he stopped me, but I wanted to see if he would ask for it or if he had already decided who I was. The crowd went silent again, the kind of silence that holds respect. He decided, Miles continued, and now you have all seen what that decision costs. The young officer Miller stood a few feet away, his face pale, guilt and disbelief mingling in his eyes. Miles turned toward him. You did the right thing, officer, remember that. Doing the right thing will not always be easy, but it will always be visible. Miller nodded slowly, emotion catching in his throat. From behind the line of reporters, a man called out, Are you going to press charges? Miles paused, considering. No, he said finally. I am not here for revenge. I am here for reform. Director Hayes stepped closer. Then you will have it. Internal Affairs will open a federal review immediately. Miles looked around at the crowd, their phones still lifted, recording, witnessing, remembering. Do not just capture this moment, he said, understand it. Because this is what bias looks like in real time. The journalist lowered her mic, visibly shaken. Hayes spoke quietly beside him. You handled that perfectly. Miles gave a faint smile. I handled it truthfully. There is a difference. His phone buzzed a message from headquarters. The bureau director wanted a statement within the hour. He read it and nodded once. Tell them I will speak, he said. Hayes frowned. Are you sure? The press is waiting for blood, Miles replied. Then let them see discipline instead. He turned toward the same officer who had once cuffed him. Reed sat in the back of the patrol car, head in his hands, humiliated and defeated. Miles approached, stopping just short of the door. I am not your enemy, he said softly, but I am your consequence. Reeds looked up, eyes red, speechless. Miles straightened his jacket and added, You will remember this day longer than I will. That is the difference between punishment and lesson. He turned back toward Hayes and the waiting cameras. Let us make it official, he said. The statement begins now. And with that, the hum of Washington Park became the sound of history catching up to itself. The press conference began an hour later inside the Bureau's downtown field office, a glass-walled room overlooking the same city that had just witnessed a public humiliation turned into a national debate. Miles Carter stood at the podium, his expression steady, his suit immaculate once more, but the faint red marks on his wrists remained visible, proof that even authority could bleed. Reporters filled every corner, cameras flashing, microphones stretched forward like eager hands. Director Hayes stood beside him, silent, her presence both protective and deferential. "Good evening," Miles began, his voice low but firm. "Today, what happened to me was not an anomaly. It was a reflection of what happens to far too many Americans who look like me but do not wear this badge." The room fell completely silent. "I was detained without probable cause," he continued, "and while I am grateful that the situation ended without violence, I cannot ignore what it represents. If this can happen to a federal agent, imagine what happens to someone without a title, without witnesses, without a camera." The words struck hard. No one in the room dared to interrupt. "This is not about a single officer," Miles said, glancing toward the back of the room where Reeds now sat under supervision, stripped of his weapon, his uniform replaced with shame. "This is about a system that has learned to act before it asks. We have built a culture where authority confuses fear for vigilance and where bias hides behind the word protocol. That ends today." Reporters scribbled frantically, trying to keep up. One asked, "Agent Carter, are you suggesting the Bureau intervene in local policing matters?" Miles looked directly into the camera. "I am not suggesting it, I am declaring it. Effective immediately, the Bureau will open a cross-agency civil rights oversight initiative. I will lead it personally." The announcement sent murmurs rippling across the room. Hayes stepped forward and handed him a folder. "The paperwork is ready," she confirmed. Miles opened it on the podium. "This task force," he said, "will review every local department under federal jurisdiction that has recorded complaints involving racial profiling in the last 5 years. Every file, every report, every silence." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Accountability is not a punishment, it is prevention." A young journalist near the front stood. "Agent Carter, many see you as a hero after today. How do you respond to that?" Miles gave a faint smile. "Heroes fix problems they did not create. I am not a hero. I am a reminder that no one is above justice, not even those who enforce it." The room erupted in applause, not the kind born from spectacle but from recognition. Reeds lowered his head, tears forming as realization replaced denial. Miles noticed, but he did not gloat. Instead, he spoke one final time. "To every officer watching this, understand that integrity is not a uniform. It is a choice. And today I choose to believe we can be better than this." Hayes nodded approvingly, her voice soft as she added, "That is how reform begins." As the conference ended, cameras followed Miles down the hall. A security guard opened the door for him, and the flashbulbs from outside poured through like daylight breaking a storm. Miles paused before stepping out, looking at his reflection in the glass. "My name will fade from the headlines," he said quietly to Hayes, "but the message will not." Outside, the crowd erupted again, some chanting his name, others holding signs that read, "Justice is not optional." He raised his hand once in acknowledgement, then walked toward the waiting car. The city lights reflected in his eyes, bright but heavy with purpose. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of handcuffs closing reminded him of where the fight had begun. And this time he intended to finish it. The following morning, the headlines stretched across every major outlet. FBI agent detained by local police leads nationwide reform. Miles Carter did not read them. He was already back at the Bureau before sunrise, reviewing files that had not seen the light of day in years. The task force room was quiet except for the hum of computers and the shuffle of paper. Director Hayes entered carrying 2 mugs of coffee. "You should rest," she said. Miles shook his head. "Rest comes after repair." Hayes set the coffee beside him. "You realize what you started yesterday has turned into a storm. The Attorney General is calling it a movement." Miles looked up from the files. "Then let the storm do what it is meant to do, clear the air." He opened another report, eyes scanning a list of names, officers dismissed or disciplined for misconduct that never reached federal review. "There are too many of these," he murmured, "too many silenced." Hayes crossed her arms. "And you plan to reopen them all?" "Every single one," Miles said, "because injustice does not expire." At that same moment, a knock sounded at the door. It was Officer Miller, the young cop who had spoken up the day before. He looked nervous but determined. "Agent Carter," he said, "I needed to apologize." Miles gestured for him to enter. "You do not need to apologize for telling the truth." Miller stepped closer. "I froze. I saw what was happening, and for a second, I thought maybe I should not interfere. I was scared to speak against my superior. Miles studied him. Courage is not about the moment you speak. It is about the second you realize silence costs more. Miller nodded, his eyes glassy. I want to help. Whatever you are building, I want in. Miles smiled slightly. Then you just joined the task force. As Miller left, Hayes watched him go. You see what you are doing, right? She said quietly. You are rebuilding trust from the inside. Miles leaned back in his chair, exhaustion flickering behind his calm. That is the only way it will last. Hours later, the conference room filled with agents, analysts, and investigators. Miles stood at the front, a large screen behind him displaying the new initiative, Federal Accountability and Reform Task Force. He spoke clearly, each word measured and deliberate. We are not here to create fear, he began. We are here to create transparency. Every department, every badge, every protocol will be reviewed. Bias is not just a personal flaw, it is a structural infection, and we are here to cure it. The agents nodded, taking notes, understanding the weight of what they were part of. Hayes stepped up beside him and added, starting today, every local precinct flagged for misconduct will receive direct oversight from this unit. There will be no more buried reports, no more missing footage, and no more silence. The room erupted in quiet applause. Miles looked at them and said, Remember, what happened in that park was not a spectacle. It was a test, and the country is watching how we respond. As the meeting ended, Hayes turned to him. There is one more thing. Reeds has requested to see you. Miles paused. What could he possibly have to say? He says he wants to apologize, she replied. Miles exhaled slowly. Set it up. That evening, as the sun sank over the city, Miles walked into the small holding office where Reeds sat across the table, his badge and weapon already surrendered. The officer looked up, eyes weary. I did not know who you were, Reeds said quietly. That is the problem, Miles replied. You should not have to know. For a long moment they said nothing. Then Reeds whispered, I was wrong. Miles nodded once. Yes, you were, but admitting it is where change begins. He stood to leave, but before walking out he added, If you truly mean it, prove it when no one is filming. Outside the room, the city lights blinked like silent witnesses. Miles walked down the hall, his reflection stretching across the polished floor. The movement had begun, not with anger but with truth. And truth, once spoken, could not be silenced again. 2 weeks later, the task force was in full operation, transforming from an emergency response into a permanent reform division. Miles Carter's name had become synonymous with accountability, though he never asked for recognition. What mattered to him was momentum. Inside the Bureau's headquarters, screens displayed real-time data cases reopened, departments flagged, and officers under review. The map of the United States glowed with activity, every blinking light representing a city where truth had been buried and was now being unearthed. Director Hayes walked into the control room holding a folder marked Priority Review. We found something, she said, her tone heavy. Miles looked up from the reports. How far back? 5 years, she replied. Multiple incidents suppressed by local supervisors patterned after the same justification used on you. Suspicious behavior. Miles's jaw tightened. Show me. Hayes opened the file. The reports detailed arrests of unarmed citizens, mostly men and women of color, all logged under vague language, acting nervous, fitting a description, possible trespass. Miles read silently, his eyes narrowing with each page. This is not negligence, he said finally. This is culture, a design built to protect itself. Hayes nodded. The question is how deep it goes. Miles turned toward the map. We dig until it stops answering. At that moment, his assistant entered, carrying a tablet. Sir, there is a statement from Officer Miller, she said. He has gone public. She handed over the screen. The video showed Miller standing in front of a precinct, speaking to local news. I was part of a system that rewarded silence, Miller said. When I saw Agent Carter being detained, I realized silence is complicity. We can do better, we must. The footage ended and Miles smiled faintly. That is courage, he said. Untrained, unprompted, but real. Hayes folded her arms. You are inspiring people, Miles, not just agents, civilians, officers, even communities that stopped believing anyone would listen. Then we cannot stop now, he replied. We are only beginning. Later that day, he addressed the task force team again. Every report we reopen will have a face attached to it. Do not let paperwork turn people into numbers. Behind every complaint is someone's father, mother, brother, or daughter who was told they did not belong. We are rewriting that message. The agents nodded solemnly. A ripple of purpose passed through the room. After the meeting, Miles stepped outside to the rooftop balcony overlooking the city. The sky was pale gold, the air heavy with the promise of change. Hayes joined him, her voice quiet. The Attorney General wants to meet next week. They want you to lead the National Policy Review. Miles's eyes stayed on the horizon. Policy is paper, he said. What we need is proof. Hayes looked at him thoughtfully. You are aware this is bigger than the Bureau now, right? Miles exhaled slowly. I know. That is why it has to stay honest. Down below, protesters had gathered again, holding signs that read, "Accountability now" and "Justice has no rank." Among them were officers, civilians, students, people who once stood on opposite sides of power now standing together. Miles watched them quietly. Do you hear that? He asked. That is what change sounds like. It is not shouting anymore. It is alignment. Hayes smiled. You sound like your father. Miles's eyes softened. He used to say fairness is not inherited, it is practiced. Every day. He looked back at the glowing skyline. Let us make sure it stays practiced. That night, as he prepared to leave, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. It read, You are making enemies in high places. Be careful. Miles stared at it for a moment, then locked his phone. Good, he whispered to himself. That means we are doing something right. Outside, the city pulsed with life, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed not as a warning, but as a reminder of the work still left to do. The following week, the press coverage had exploded. Miles Carter's name was on every news outlet, in every headline. The movement he had sparked was no longer just an investigation. It was a rallying cry, a demand for change that reached beyond the walls of the Bureau. Even the president's office had issued a statement recognizing his efforts. Yet, as the momentum grew, so did the pressure. Miles had always known this day would come, the day when the system would push back. He sat in his office late into the evening, the light from his desk lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Hayes entered without knocking, holding a stack of documents. We have a problem, she said, her tone serious. Miles leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. How bad? The resistance is organized. We've received internal memos targeting the task force, suggesting that some of our agents are too aggressive, that our methods are damaging to agency reputation. Miles stared at her for a moment. The system is fighting back. Hayes nodded. And it's coming from high-up people you never thought would object are suddenly calling for restraint. Miles stood, his expression hardening. Restraint is how we got here in the first place. What's the plan? Hayes handed him the folder. The public's behind you, but the inner circle is splitting. Some are already calling for you to step down from leading the task force, suggesting that your methods are too radical. Miles flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening as he read. The names, the positions, they were all familiar. Allies from the past were now hesitant, unsure whether to stand with him or against him. He placed the folder down and turned toward the window. So what do we do? He asked, his voice low but unwavering. We fight, Hayes said simply. We don't back down now. Miles nodded. We can't afford to. Not after everything we've seen. That evening, Miles called for an emergency meeting with the entire task force. When the agents filed in, they were greeted with a heavy silence. Miles stood at the front, his usual calm replaced by a quiet intensity. This is not just about cleaning up one department or one precinct, he began. This is about a system that has failed far too many for far too long. If we do not fight for real accountability now, we will have failed everyone who has ever been hurt by this. The agents were silent, each one understanding the gravity of what Miles was asking. He paused, looking at each of them. The people on the outside are watching. They believe in what we are doing. They believe in us. If we back down now, we lose them, and we lose the trust we have built. One of the senior agents, an older man who had been with the Bureau for over 20 years, spoke up. But Miles, these are high-level people. You've seen the memos. They have power. We are up against more than just resistance. I know, Miles said, and we'll face them. But we will do it with transparency. We will let the world see what happens when you choose the truth over the system that hides it. The room was still. For the first time, it wasn't just about arrests or investigations. It was about the principles that had driven Miles from the very beginning. Hayes spoke next. We have the public on our side. We have the law. And we have each other. We do not need anyone's permission to do what is right. Miles nodded. This task force is not just a mission, it is a movement, and no one can stop that. The agents stood, one by one, a show of unity and determination. As the meeting ended, Miles looked around the room and felt a surge of pride. This was more than just reform. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one that could never be erased, no matter how hard the system fought to bury it. As the agents filed out, Hayes stayed behind. She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you ready for what's coming?" she asked. Miles didn't hesitate. "I've been ready for this since the day I first joined." He turned back toward the window, looking out over the city as the first light of dawn began to break through the horizon. "Let it come. We are ready." The next few days were a whirlwind, as pressure from both internal and external sources intensified. Miles Carter found himself in the center of a storm, the eyes of the nation upon him. The support from the public was undeniable, but so was the resistance from the higher echelons of the Bureau. Agents began to take sides, some with him, others quietly stepping back, unwilling to challenge the system that had long been in place. Inside the Bureau's headquarters, tensions were high. Miles and Director Hayes stood in the briefing room, surrounded by reports, statistics, and strategic plans that mapped out the coming months. "They're trying to stall us," Hayes said, her tone sharp. "The higher-ups want us to take a step back, give them time to reevaluate our approach. They think the heat will die down." Miles glanced at the papers before him, his mind racing. "We don't have time for reevaluation. This is not just about us. It's about every person who has been forgotten by the system, every life that has been discarded because of prejudice." He paused, meeting Hayes' eyes. "We're not slowing down." Hayes nodded, her determination matching his. "I've been working on a national initiative. We can get more public support behind us, speak to the people who are already on our side. It's time to make this official. If the Bureau won't back us, we will make sure the country does." Miles looked out the window, the skyline stretching before him. The weight of what they were about to do settled over him. This was bigger than any single case, any single officer. This was about changing a system, and systems didn't change quietly. "Do it," he said finally. "Get it moving. We're going public." The next morning, the announcement came. The Federal Accountability and Reform Task Force would now operate under a national mandate with new public outreach programs to engage communities directly impacted by law enforcement bias. The statement hit every major news outlet, the headlines flashing across televisions and computer screens. For the first time, Miles felt the true power of what they were doing. The fight for justice was no longer just an internal battle. It was out in the open, where it could no longer be ignored. As the days went by, the pressure mounted, but so did their resolve. The task force began its review of cases, uncovering systemic failures one by one. Officers from various departments were placed under investigation, some willingly, others reluctantly. Reeds, the officer who had once arrested Miles, was among the first to be called in for questioning. He sat in front of Miles, his face drawn, his eyes tired. "I was wrong," he admitted quietly. "I see that now. I didn't want to believe it, but you were right." Miles didn't respond right away. He simply nodded, letting the weight of Reed's words sink in. "You still have a chance to do something good," Miles said finally. "But it starts with accountability, and it starts with you." As Reeds walked out of the room, a weight seemed to lift from him, though it was clear that the path to redemption was not an easy one. Meanwhile, the public continued to rally. Protests, marches, and online campaigns all grew in number and strength, demanding that those in power listen, demanding that those who had been oppressed for so long finally have their voices heard. Miles watched it all unfold from his office. He knew the battle was far from over, but for the first time, he allowed himself to feel a sense of hope. The tide was turning, slowly but surely, and there was no turning back now. As the weeks passed, the momentum behind the Federal Accountability and Reform Task Force grew. Miles Carter, once just another face within the Bureau, had become the symbol of a movement. The country was watching, the pressure mounting, but so too was the support. Each day brought new discoveries, cases of misconduct, corruption, and racial profiling that had been buried for years, now uncovered. The task force worked tirelessly, going through each file with a level of detail and care that had never been given before. There were moments when Miles would sit back in his office, staring at the papers before him, feeling the weight of it all. He knew this was just the beginning, but the stakes were high. If they didn't get this right, the damage would be irreparable. Yet, with every new case they uncovered, he felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. The system was fighting back. There were leaks, whispers in the halls, even threats against his life. But it only made him more determined. The truth was out now, and it wasn't going away. One evening, as the sun set over the city, Miles received an unexpected visitor, Reeds. The officer who had once detained him, now standing in front of him, no longer in uniform, his face a mixture of regret and uncertainty. "I need to talk to you," Reeds said, his voice low. Miles looked at him, the memories of that day in Washington Park flooding back. "You wanted to apologize?" Miles said, his tone flat. "No," Reeds replied. "I came to ask for help." Miles raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Help? After everything you've done?" Reeds took a deep breath. "I know I was wrong. I see that now. But I want to do better. I don't know where to start, but I want to be part of this change, Miles." There was a long pause. Miles studied him carefully, weighing his words. "It doesn't work like that," he said finally. "You don't just walk away from the things you've done and expect to be redeemed. But it starts with owning what you've done, and then doing the work. It doesn't end with an apology, it ends with action." Reeds nodded, his face pale. "I'm ready for that." Miles sighed. "We'll see, but you're going to have to prove it." The meeting ended quietly, and Miles found himself lost in thought as Reeds left. The road ahead was long, and redemption was a hard path. But maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for someone like Reeds if he was willing to do the work. As Miles sat back in his chair, his phone buzzed with an alert from the public relations team. The next phase of the campaign was ready. There was no turning back now. They were committed, and so was he. The system would change, one step at a time, and this was just the beginning. The next few days felt like a blur, with one meeting after another, each more intense than the last. Miles Carter had become the face of reform, a symbol of justice, and the weight of that role was starting to wear on him. There were still days when he found himself questioning if the work they were doing would truly lead to lasting change, or if it was just another wave in a system designed to stay the same. His phone buzzed, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Director Hayes. "We need you in the briefing room. Something big has come up." He stood up, stretching before walking to the door. As he entered the briefing room, Hayes was already standing by the whiteboard, pointing to a new report on the screen. "We've just received information about a major corruption case," she said, her voice steady but urgent. "It involves multiple high-ranking officials both inside the Bureau and local law enforcement, and it's bigger than we thought." Miles's pulse quickened. "How big are we talking?" Hayes looked at him, her expression serious. "This could go all the way to the top. The kind of corruption that has been festering for years, quietly keeping the system in place." Miles knew what that meant. If they were going after powerful people, the stakes had just been raised. He leaned forward, his eyes focused. "We need to act fast but carefully. We can't let them see us coming." Hayes nodded. "I've already got a team in place, but I need you to lead this. You're the one they trust now. You're the one who can get this done." Miles took a deep breath. The pressure was mounting, but he was ready. This was the fight he had been waiting for, the chance to finally break the system wide open. "Let's do it," he said, his voice unwavering. They moved quickly, assembling a team of agents, analysts, and investigators. Miles led them through the process, reviewing files, making calls, and coordinating with various law enforcement agencies. The case was as complex as it was dangerous. It seemed that every piece of evidence they uncovered only led to more questions, more people involved, and more risks. But as the investigation continued, the trail grew hotter. With every new discovery, it became clearer that they were up against something that had been hidden in plain sight for far too long. One night, as Miles sat in his office going over new evidence, he got a call from Hayes. "We've got them," she said, her voice filled with a mix of relief and triumph. "We have enough to make arrests." Miles felt a surge of adrenaline. "Then let's move. We do it now, while they think they're still in control." The next few hours were a blur of action, coordinating the arrests, securing evidence, and making sure nothing slipped through the cracks. By the end of the night, several high-ranking officials had been taken into custody, their careers shattered, their crimes exposed. Miles stood outside the Bureau headquarters as the first light of dawn broke through the darkness. The work was far from over, but in that moment, he allowed himself a brief sense of satisfaction. They had done it. They had uncovered the corruption and brought it into the light. But he knew this was only the beginning. The system was broken, and it would take more than one victory to fix it. He turned to Hayes, who stood beside him. "We've just opened the door," he said quietly. "Now we have to make sure it stays open." Hayes nodded. "And we will, together." Miles looked out over the city, the horizon filled with promise. The fight was far from over, but now they had the power to finish it. The next few weeks were a blur of trials, hearings, and investigations that kept the team working around the clock. The arrests had shaken the foundation of the Bureau and local law enforcement, but it was clear that the fight was far from over. The corruption they had exposed was just the tip of the iceberg. Miles Carter and Director Hayes led the charge, diving deeper into the network of deceit that had festered for years. As each layer of the conspiracy was peeled back, the scope of the problem became clearer. Miles could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the responsibility on his shoulders. The public had placed their trust in him, and he was determined not to let them down. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Miles stood by the window of his office, staring out over the city. He had come a long way from the man who had once been just another agent in the Bureau. Now he was leading a movement, changing a broken system. But there was still so much more to be done. Hayes entered the room, a folder in her hand. "We've got another one," she said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "Another case?" Miles asked, turning to face her. Hayes nodded. "It's bigger than we thought. This goes beyond law enforcement. It's corporate. Politics. It's everywhere." Miles felt the familiar tightness in his chest. He had known it wouldn't be easy, but hearing it laid out in front of him was a sobering moment. He could feel the magnitude of what they were up against. "How do we approach this?" he asked. Hayes paused, then set the folder down on his desk. "The same way we've approached everything else. We expose it, we hold them accountable, and we don't back down." Miles nodded. The path ahead was clear, though still daunting. "Let's get to work," he said. Over the next few days, the task force worked relentlessly to uncover the new web of corruption that stretched into every corner of society. The connections were deep, and the threats were real. But with every piece of evidence they gathered, the truth became more undeniable. The team grew stronger, more determined. The phone calls, the messages, the covert meetings, it all began to fall into place. And soon, they were ready. The night before the next round of arrests, Miles stood alone in his office, staring at the files that lay before him. This was it, the moment they had been working toward. The corruption that had poisoned the system for so long was finally going to be brought into the light. But even as he prepared for the fight ahead, a sense of peace settled over him. They were no longer fighting alone. The people were with them. And this time, they were not going to stop until every last piece of the system was reformed. As dawn broke the next morning, Miles looked out over the city once more, his heart steady. "Let it come," he said quietly to himself. "We're ready."